The focus of this area of inquiry and research has been on acculturation and understanding the degree to which undocumented Hispanic immigrants are able to retain versus discard their cultural heritage and acquire or reject U.S. culture. So, broadly defined, acculturation refers to the contact that occurs between people from two different cultures, as well as a cultural change that occurs as a result of that contact. Undocumented immigrants are faced with a whole host of additional challenges that may make the process of acculturation more difficult. So when we talk about undocumented immigrants, what we're referring to is foreign-born residents who are not classified as U.S. citizens, do not hold a permanent resident visa, and have not been granted permission for temporary work status or residence in the United States. So contemporary views on the subject of acculturation have largely drawn on John Barry's acculturation model. Barry argues that cultural retention, so heritage cultural retention, and receiving cultural acquisition, or U.S. cultural acquisition, are separate dimensions. And he crossed heritage retention and U.S. acquisition and created 4 categories of cultural adaptation. The first is assimilation. The individual acquires the customs, beliefs, values of the receiving culture and discards their heritage culture. Separation is the opposite. It's the rejection of the receiving society while the retention of one's heritage culture. Marginalization is the rejection of both. That's why they're culturally marginalized in this context. And then integration, which is more and more often referred to as biculturalism, represents the retention of one's heritage culture coupled by the acquisition of U.S. culture. So within our study, within our latent profile analysis, what we found is we found partial support for Barry's model in that we were able to find 3 distinct profiles that fit Barry's conceptualization. About 43% of the sample fell into what we classified as separated. In other words, they had high levels of heritage identification, but low levels of U.S. identity. About 24% of the sample fell into what we termed a bicultural approach. They were both high in heritage and high in U.S. cultural identification. And the last profile that we found, about a third, 32%, fell into what we called a marginalized profile, marked by low levels of heritage identification and low levels of U.S. identification. So what these findings indicate to us is that undocumented immigrants are not only feeling rejected by the context of reception by the United States, and as a result unable to identify with being American, but they're also devaluing their own heritage culture. This marginalized profile had the highest risk factor for mental illness, versus the bicultural profile actually indicated to have quite strong positive outcomes. There are key points in terms of the relevancy and timeliness of this research study. The undocumented Hispanics have been at the center of divisive and political debates on immigration and have often been portrayed as a threat. Hardline policies on immigrations, coupled by the xenophobic rhetoric that we're seeing within our political discourse, these are having effects. As a result, there is really a critical need for understanding the factors that contribute to the overall mental health of these vulnerable and neglected population. Despite these challenges and barriers they've experienced, they still are seeking to become American. They're still seeking to become accepted. We really do need additional research to understand how this degree of marginalization and potential trauma that are being experienced by particularly the children who are being separated from their families, how this leads to mental health issues down the road. Will they be able to view themselves as American in light of the trauma that they may have experienced as part of this process? We need to explore this. We need to understand factors that are going to contribute to mental health among this population and identify ways in which we can assist them in adapting to the broader context of reception should they be granted asylum, and how we can as a whole, both undocumented and documented immigrants, how we may help them integrate into the broader U.S. context.